Welcome to Darkness Falls. I'm your host Adnan. This is episode 8, The Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, to Cleo and Phoebe Short. Elizabeth, her parents, and her 4 sisters lived in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Cleo, her father, left the family during the Depression because he went bankrupt. He abandoned his car on the Charlestown Bridge, and it was assumed that he had jumped into the Charles River. However, in late 1942, Short's mother received a letter of apology from her presumed deceased husband, which revealed that he was in fact alive and had started a new life in California. Elizabeth lived a fairly normal life growing up. However, she did have respiratory problems which eventually caused her to spend the winters in Miami, Florida. At a young age, Short developed a strong affinity for cinema. By her teens, she had set her sights on becoming an actress. Her aspiration of being an actress led her to move to California with her father. She did not get along with him and they had frequent fights. She moved out in January of 1943 to pick up a job in the base exchange of Camp Cook, Lompoc, California. She had applied for a job as a clerk at the commissioner of the army camp. She left Lompoc in mid-1943 and moved to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested on September 23, 1943, for drinking at a local bar while being underage. The juvenile authorities sent her back to Massachusetts, but she returned to Florida instead, making only occasional visits to her mother near Boston. During her stay in Florida, she met Major Matthew Michael Gordon, a decorated Army Air Force officer of the 2nd Air Commando Group, who was training for deployment to Southeast Asian theater of World War II. Short later told her friends that Gordon had written to propose marriage while he was recovering from injuries from a plane crash in India. She accepted his offer, but Gordon died in a second plane crash on August 10, 1945, less than a week before the end of the war. After the death of her fiancé, Elizabeth returned to Los Angeles. While she hoped to become a movie star, she never worked in the film industry. In July 1946, Elizabeth went to Los Angeles to visit an old boyfriend named Joseph Fickling. However, Fickling moved to another state. Elizabeth then stayed in hotels and people's homes, never staying anywhere for very long. No one is certain how Elizabeth got money, but she always ate and paid rent to whomever she happened to owe it. She lived in various Los Angeles hotels and apartments with different friends. Between May and October of 1946, Elizabeth lived in Hollywood with Mark Hansen, who owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub, and his girlfriend Ann Todd. Ann promised to use her connections to get Elizabeth movie extra work. The living arrangement didn't last long. During late 1946, Elizabeth was dating a married man named Robert Manley, known as Red because of the color of his hair. On 8 January 1947, Manley drove her to Los Angeles from their trip to San Diego. They spent the night in a motel, but Manley said they did not sleep together. The next day, Thursday, 9 January 1947, Manley took Elizabeth to the Los Angeles bus station where she deposited her luggage. She asked him to drive her to the Biltmore Hotel where she would meet her sister. This was a lie on Elizabeth's part as her sister was in Oakland. Red waited with Elizabeth in the hotel lobby and left at 6:30 p.m. By some accounts, staff of the Biltmore recalled having seen Short using the lobby telephone. Shortly after, she was seen by patrons of the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge at approximately 600 meters away from the Biltmore Hotel. Those were the last reported sightings of Elizabeth Short alive. Unfortunately, where Elizabeth went afterwards and what she did in the next 6 days is a mystery. At some point, she met her killer. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman named Betty was pushing her 3-year-old daughter Anne in a stroller down the sidewalk in Los Angeles neighborhood, heading to a shoe repair shop. She paused when she noticed what she thought was a mannequin lying in the grass. But as she looked closer, she discovered it was something much more alarming: a mutilated corpse. Betty grabbed her daughter Anne and ran into a nearby house, where she used the telephone to call the police. Police officers on the scene were taken back by the gruesomeness of the scene. Her killer severed through her torso. She was posed with her arms over her head. Despite the extensive mutilation and cuts on the body, there wasn't a drop of blood at the scene, indicating that the young woman had been killed elsewhere. The ensuing investigation was led by the LA Police Department. The FBI was asked to help, and it quickly identified the body after getting blurred fingerprints. The fingerprints matched that of a girl who was arrested for underage drinking back in 1943. Her name turned out to be Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth Short's body had been cut in half at the waist, and her blood had been drained out. Her face had been cut from the corners of her mouth to the ears to give her what people would call today the Joker smile. There were numerous cuts and bruises on her breasts and thighs. An autopsy showed that she ultimately died because of lacerations and a hemorrhage on her head due to blows to her face. All of these suggested that she was tortured prior to her death. After Elizabeth died, the killer bisected her using a procedure taught in 1930s medical schools. It was an extremely complicated procedure that required the separation of the lumbar spine at the space between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. Once she was cut in two and drained of blood, she was placed in a cooler. This method suggested that the killer might be of a medical background or someone with a lot of knowledge about human anatomy. The guilty man had to be a doctor, mortician, or even a butcher with plenty of experience. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Short's mother, Phoebe Short, didn't learn of her daughter's death until reporters from the Los Angeles Examiner telephoned her, pretending that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest. They asked her for all the details they could get on Elizabeth before revealing the terrible truth. Her daughter had been murdered, and her corpse had been dismembered in unspeakable ways. As the media learned about Elizabeth Short's history, they began to brand her as a sexual deviant. One police report read, "The victim knew at least 50 men at the time of her death, and at least 25 men had been seen with her in the 60 days preceding her death. She was known as a teaser of men." They gave Short the nickname the Black Dahlia due to her reported preference for wearing a lot of sheer black clothing. It was also a reference to the movie The Blue Dahlia, which was out at that time. The police believed that the intimate nature of Elizabeth's injuries were a sign of personal vendetta. They were passionate injuries which suggested the killer might have known her. The criminal displayed her corpse, posed as if to humiliate her in death. They looked at every man Elizabeth had contact with. On January 21, 1947, a person claiming to be Short's killer placed a phone call to the office of James Richardson, the editor of the Examiner, congratulating Richardson on the newspaper's coverage of the case, and stated he planned on eventually turning himself in, but not before allowing police to pursue him further. Additionally, the caller told Richardson to expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail. On January 24, 1947, he sent a package to the Los Angeles Examiner. It contained Short's birth certificate, social security card, photos, and an address book belonging not to Elizabeth, but to an acquaintance of hers named Mark Hansen. In the package was a message made up of words cut from newspapers. It said, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, and letter to follow." These items were soaked in gasoline to remove fingerprints. The killer seemed to taunt the police. As Mark Hansen's address book was sent by the possible killer, the police suspected Hansen himself. Although if Mark was the killer, he likely would not call and admit it, promised to send proof and then send his own name. Robert Manley needed to be ruled out as a suspect as well, being the last man to speak with Elizabeth. Police found a handbag and a shoe in a trash can on the day the package was received. Manley identified these items as Elizabeth's. The police eventually ruled out that Manley may have been a terrible husband, but he wasn't Short's killer. Neither Mark nor Manley had medical training. They surely didn't know how to bisect a human with the skill shown by Elizabeth's killer. However, Mark Hansen had a friend named Leslie Dillon who may have. 27-year-old Leslie was a bellboy, writer, and a former mortician's assistant who lived in LA at the time Elizabeth died. The October following Elizabeth's murder, Leslie began writing to Dr. Paul DeRiver, the LAPD psychiatrist, about the case. Leslie, fascinated with sadism and sexual violence, Leslie pretended his interest was strictly business. Research for a book. Leslie told DeRiver he suspected his friend Jeff Connors of the crime. Over time, Dr. River grew suspicious that Jeff Connors didn't exist, but was a split personality of Leslie's. The doctor theorized that Leslie killed Elizabeth. Leslie declined to meet Dr. River in Los Angeles to discuss the murder in person, but agreed to meet him in Las Vegas. Leslie shared intimate details about the killing and was arrested. Investigators located Jeff Connors. His actual name was Artie Lane, and he was a janitor at Columbia Studios. Police never suspected him. Leslie convinced investigators that he was in San Francisco between January 9 and January 15. The alibi was later disproven and Leslie is now dead. Over the years, there have been many other suspects in the Black Dahlia case. Another notable suspect was Dr. George Hodel, who lived and worked in Hollywood. He was a shady character. Dr. Hodel was a likely abortionist who raped his own daughter. Investigators located Jeff Connors. His actual name was Artie Lane and he was a janitor at Columbia Studios. Police never suspected him. Leslie convinced the investigators that he was in San Francisco between 9 and 15 January 1947. The alibi was later disproven and Leslie is now dead. Over the years, there have been many suspects in the Black Dahlia case. Another notable suspect was Dr. George Hodel, who lived and worked in Hollywood. He was a shady character. Dr. Hodel was a likely abortionist who allegedly raped his own daughter. Dr. Hodel was a suspect in the death of Elizabeth Short. Years earlier, he was implicated in the murder of his secretary. By 1950, he was the prime suspect in the eyes of LAPD, though they didn't make it public. The police went so far as to bug his home and recorded Mr. Hodel saying this: "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her? Maybe I did kill my secretary." Although he was mentioned by name to the grand jury along with 5 other suspects, he was never considered for indictment. Now the suspects were. By the time they had enough evidence to arrest him, Dr. Hodel left the country and started a new family. Dr. Hodel's son, Steve Hodel, grew up to be a respected homicide detective with the LAPD, who believes his father was the killer of Elizabeth Short. Steve authored several books explaining his evidence. He doesn't shy away from the fact that his father had the surgical skill to perform the mutilation caused to Short. Since the day Dahlia died, the police identified over 60 suspects. 25 were viable. Most have been disproven. While the case of the Black Dahlia is still unsolved, there are many theories about who could have committed this crime. A large number of people have actually come forward to confess the crime, but most of these confessions have been proved to be false. Some crime authors have made a link to the Black Dahlia murder and the Cleveland Torso murders, which took place between 1934 and 1938. There have been other authors as well producing their own theories. In her book Black Dahlia, Red Rose, The Crime, Corruption and Cover-Up of America's Great Unsolved Murder, British author Pew Itwell theorized that Leslie the bellboy was actually the killer. According to the theory, Leslie was put up for the murder by Mark Hansen. Itwell suggested that Hansen was infatuated with Short and came to her, though she rebuffed his advances. Then he supposedly called on Leslie Dillon to take care of her. Hansen, it seemed, knew Dylan was capable of murder but didn't realize just how deranged he really was. Previously, Leslie had worked as a mortician's assistant, where he could have potentially learned how to bleed a body dry. Eatwell also discovered from police record that Dylan knew details about the crime that had not been released to the public. One detail was that Short had a tattoo of a rose on her thigh. Despite all the evidence pointing to him, Dylan was never charged with the crime. Eatwell claims he was released due to Mark Hansen's ties to some of the cops at LAPD. While Eatwell believes the department was corrupt to begin with, she also thinks that Hansen contributed largely to its corruption by exploiting his ties to certain officers. Despite the numerous theories about what truly happened to Elizabeth Short, the case remains unsolved. The Black Dahlia murder is one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in the world. The Black Dahlia's murder inspired countless books and films. Among the most famous fictional accounts of Short's death is James Ellroy's 1987 novel, The Black Dahlia. The character inspired by Short also appeared in 2 episodes of the show American Horror Story. Elizabeth Short wanted to achieve Hollywood fame and become an actress. However, she would only achieve the fame in death. Thank you for listening to Darkness Falls. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share this episode. You can also follow Darkness Falls Pod on Instagram and Darkness Falls on Facebook and YouTube for future episodes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.